The silence of space was punctuated by the dying whispers of civilizations. Holographic displays flickered with the last transmissions of worlds consumed by an implacable enemy, their final moments captured in streams of data that spoke of unimaginable horror. Jake Harrison pressed his palm against the reinforced carving glass of the observation deck, watching another star system fade from existence. Starbase Omega hung in the void like a lonely sentinel, the last outpost of humanity's deepest space research initiative. Behind him, the station hummed with nervous energy, a combination of fear, desperation, and the faint remnant of hope that still flickered in human hearts. The Void Swarm was unlike any threat encountered in galactic history. It wasn't a traditional enemy with ships, weapons, or territorial ambitions. It was a collective intelligence that consumed everything in its path: mechanical, biological, even the fundamental structures of spacetime itself. Civilizations that had existed for millennia were reduced to fragmented memories in mere solar cycles. Central Command had long since abandoned any pretense of a coordinated defense. The Galactic Confederation, once a proud alliance of over 200 spacefaring species, had been reduced to scattered refugee fleets and isolated outposts. Jake had watched as species far more advanced than humanity were systematically erased, their technological marvels turned to cosmic dust in moments. Incoming transmission, chirped the station's communication system. The holographic display crackled to life, revealing Admiral Konstantin Volkov, one of the few remaining high-ranking officers in the human expeditionary forces. His face was a map of exhaustion, deep lines carved by sleepless nights and impossible decisions. "Harrison," the Admiral's voice was a low, gravelly whisper, "we're down to our last strategic options. The Centauri Research Division has been completely overrun. Their final data burst suggests the swarm is developing new consumption techniques faster than we can analyze them." Jake's fingers traced the holographic representation of the known galaxy. What had once been a vibrant network of star systems now looked like a partially eaten piece of fruit. Dark patches of consumed space spreading like a cancer, consuming everything in its path. The human territories, once considered a minor footnote in galactic politics, now represented one of the few remaining pockets of resistance. "We're tracking unusual quantum resonance patterns," Jake responded, pulling up a series of complex mathematical models. "The swarm isn't just consuming, it's learning, adapting at a rate that defies our current understanding of collective intelligence." The station's auxiliary systems hummed with increased intensity. Specialized sensors designed to monitor quantum fluctuations were working overtime, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible data streaming in from the consumption zones. Each analysis revealed more questions than answers. Admiral Volkov's hologram flickered, a testament to the degrading communication networks. "We've lost contact with the Proxima colonies." The last transmission suggested complete system integration within minutes of initial contact. His voice carried a weight of resignation that Jake found unbearable. But Jake saw something others didn't. Where most saw random destruction, he perceived patterns, complex, almost mathematical in their precision. The Void Swarm wasn't a mindless consuming force. It was something far more sophisticated and potentially vulnerable. Outside the observation deck, the vast emptiness of space seemed to pulse with an alien rhythm. Distant stars flickered, some winking out of existence as the swarm continued its relentless advance. Humanity stood on the precipice of total extinction, with nothing but a handful of research stations and a dwindling fleet standing between civilization and total annihilation. Jake Harrison understood something critical in that moment. Traditional warfare, technological superiority, even the most advanced defensive strategies, none of these would work against an enemy that could adapt faster than any known intelligence could comprehend. Something fundamental would need to change. As if sensing his thoughts, the station's quantum sensors began to pulse with an unusual frequency. Something was coming. Something was changing. And humanity's last hope might rest on understanding a threat that had already consumed countless civilizations more advanced than their own. The game was about to change. and Jake Harrison was ready to play. The research lab looked like a graveyard of scientific dreams. Stacks of data crystals lined shelves covered in a thin layer of dust, each one containing years of rejected research and impossible theories. Empty coffee mugs and half-eaten protein bars testify to countless sleepless nights of investigation. Jake Harrison moved between workstations with the precision of a surgeon, his mind racing faster than the quantum processors surrounding him. Most of his colleagues had long since abandoned their research, transferred to more practical survival efforts, or simply given up hope. But Jake saw something in the void swarm that no one else had managed to perceive. Mathematical patterns. Not just simple repetitive structures, but complex, almost living algorithms that suggested an intelligence far beyond conventional understanding. He spread out a series of holographic projections, each one representing different stages of the swarm's consumption of various star systems. To the untrained eye, they appeared random. To Jake, they were a language waiting to be decoded. "Dr. Harrison," interrupted the station's eye assistant, "your research funding has been officially terminated. Recommendation: transfer to emergency response protocols." Jake didn't even look up. "Denied," he muttered, his fingers dancing across quantum interface panels. The AI fell silent, recognizing the futility of arguing with a mind completely consumed by its obsession. He had been tracking something extraordinary. Each time the void swarm consumed a system, it left behind microscopic information patterns. Not data, exactly, but something more fundamental, quantum resonance signatures that seemed to carry a form of collective memory. Most researchers had dismissed these as random noise, but Jake saw them as a potential Rosetta Stone. Pulling up recordings from the last dozen consumed systems, he began a cross-referential analysis that would have taken traditional supercomputers centuries to complete. The quantum processors hummed, creating complex interference patterns that mapped the swarm's consumption methodology. A breakthrough emerged slowly, like a sculpture being revealed from a block of marble. The swarm wasn't consuming. It was communicating. Every system absorption was not just destruction, but a form of information exchange. Each consumed civilization added to a collective intelligence that grew more complex with every encounter. Traditional defensive strategies had failed because humanity and other species viewed the swarm as an enemy to be fought, rather than a language to be understood. Jake's research had been systematically rejected by every major scientific institution. The Galactic Confederation's top minds saw his work as the ravings of a man driven mad by impending extinction. But madness and genius had always been separated by a razor-thin line. He began reconstructing the quantum communication patterns, developing a translation matrix that could potentially interpret the swarm's fundamental communication method. It wasn't about fighting. It was about understanding. Hours turned into days. The station's emergency systems periodically warned about power consumption, but Jake barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the complex dance of quantum algorithms and strange, pulsing information patterns. Most researchers had approached the void swarm as a military problem. Jake saw it as a linguistic challenge. How do you communicate with an intelligence that doesn't recognize individual consciousness? How do you negotiate with an entity that sees entire civilizations as nothing more than information packets? The answer, he believed, lay in understanding the underlying communication structure. Not translation, exactly, but a fundamental reimagining of intelligence itself. A warning alarm broke his concentration. Proximity sensors detected unusual quantum fluctuations near the station's outer perimeter. The void swarm was getting closer. Most would see this as a moment of terror. Jake saw it as an opportunity. His latest algorithm began to take shape, a complex mathematical model that could potentially serve as a communication bridge. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a defensive strategy. It was something far more radical. First contact, in the truest sense of the word. As distant stars began to wink out of existence, Jake Harrison continued his work. Humanity's last hope might not come from its military might, but from its capacity to see patterns where others saw only chaos. The universe was about to change, and Jake was ready to be its translator. The experimental chamber resembled a cross between a medical bay and a quantum physics laboratory. Specialized containment units lined the walls, each designed to withstand extreme environmental conditions. Jake Harrison stood before a review board of holographic projections, the last remaining scientific council of the human expeditionary forces. "Your proposal is insane," declared Dr. Elena Rodriguez, her holographic image crackling with barely contained frustration. "You're suggesting we can modify human neural networks to interface directly with an alien collective intelligence." Jake's presentation continued, unfazed. Years of rejection had tempered his resolve into something far stronger than mere stubbornness. "We're not just talking about modification," he explained, "but a fundamental reimagining of neural communication. The void swarm consumes by assimilating information structures. We need to become something it cannot predict or integrate." Funding had been impossible to secure through traditional channels, so Jake had taken a more unconventional approach. He'd leveraged every personal connection, every remaining favor, and most of his personal resources to cobble together a research initiative that existed in the shadows of humanity's desperate survival efforts. The experimental protocols were unlike anything in medical or scientific history. Jake proposed creating a human neural interface that could not just resist the swarm's assimilation process, but actively disrupt its collective intelligence. It was a quantum leap beyond traditional defensive strategies, less about fighting and more about fundamentally changing the rules of engagement. "We'll need volunteers," Jake continued, bringing up complex holographic models of neural restructuring. "Individuals who understand that this isn't just an experiment. This is potentially humanity's last chance." The selection process was brutal. Hundreds of potential candidates were screened, not just for physical and mental compatibility, but for a specific psychological profile. Jake needed individuals who could think beyond conventional boundaries, who saw the universe as a complex system of communication rather than a battlefield. 12 candidates emerged from thousands of applicants. They represented a cross-section of humanity that defied traditional military or scientific stereotypes. A deep space mining engineer, a quantum computing specialist, a linguist who had dedicated her life to studying alien communication patterns, a virtual reality designer. Each brought a unique perspective that Jake believed could be crucial to the experiment. The first phase of testing pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. Neural interfaces were developed that could create quantum entanglement patterns more complex than entire computer networks. The candidates underwent procedures that would have been considered impossible just years earlier. "We're not creating soldiers," Jake explained to the first group of volunteers. "We're creating translators. Our goal is to develop a neural network that can communicate with an intelligence that doesn't recognize individual consciousness." The medical risks were astronomical. Early prototype tests showed potential for complete neural breakdown, psychological fragmentation, or worse. But with the void swarm consuming entire star systems, the volunteers saw this as humanity's only remaining option. Dr. Rodriguez's holographic image continued to protest. "This is beyond experimental. This is technological suicide." Jake's response was calm, almost philosophical. "We've tried everything else. Traditional warfare, advanced defensive technologies, diplomatic attempts. Nothing has slowed the swarm's consumption. We need to become something entirely new." The first successful neural interface prototype emerged after weeks of continuous testing. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a defensive system. It was a communication bridge that could potentially allow human consciousness to interact with the void swarm at its most fundamental level. As the first volunteer was prepared for full neural integration, the station's emergency systems blared a warning. Long-range sensors detected massive void swarm activity approaching their sector. Time was running out. Jake looked at the 12 volunteers, each one representing humanity's last, most desperate hope. They weren't just test subjects. They were potential translators of an intelligence that had consumed countless civilizations. "We're about to change everything," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The experiment was about to begin. The transformation was nothing like anyone had anticipated. Marcus Chen was the first to fully integrate with the experimental neural interface. His body convulsed on the medical platform, quantum-enhanced bioscaffolding interweaving with his nervous system in ways that defied traditional understanding of human physiology. Monitoring screens erupted with impossible data streams, biological signals that seemed to exist between states of matter and information. Jake Harrison watched, his breath caught in his throat. Years of research had culminated in this moment. 12 volunteers lay in specialized containment units, each connected to a complex web of quantum processors and biological interface systems. The medical team, led by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, worked with a combination of terror and fascination. Neural coherence at 47%, announced the primary monitoring system. Quantum entanglement increasing. Biological adaptation in progress. Marcus's skin began to shift, not physically changing, but seeming to vibrate at a frequency just beyond normal human perception. His brain activity displayed patterns that looked less like traditional neural networks and more like complex communication algorithms. He wasn't just being modified. He was becoming something entirely new. The other volunteers showed similar responses. Sarah Miller, a quantum computing specialist, began to emit low-frequency electromagnetic pulses that interfered with nearby electronic systems. James Rodriguez, a deep space mining engineer, developed microscopic neural tendrils that seemed capable of processing information at speeds exponentially faster than any known computer. "We're seeing something unprecedented," Dr. Rodriguez muttered, reviewing the initial data. "They're not just adapting. They're translating." The pain was beyond description. Each volunteer experienced a complete reconstruction of their neural pathways, their very consciousness rewritten at the quantum level. Traditional pain management systems were useless. The human body was being transformed into a living communication interface, capable of engaging with the void swarm's collective intelligence. Jake monitored every microscopic change. Where others saw suffering, he saw possibility. Humanity had always been defined by its ability to adapt, to become something new when faced with impossible challenges. This was adaptation taken to its most extreme conclusion. 48 hours into the process, something extraordinary happened. The volunteers began to communicate, not through traditional language, but through complex quantum resonance patterns. Their consciousness seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple states, capable of processing information in ways that defied human understanding. "We're detecting quantum communication signatures," reported the primary monitoring system. "Neural patterns suggest multi-dimensional information processing." Marcus Chen was the first to speak. But speak was too limited a term. He projected a communication burst that was part language, part mathematical algorithm, part emotional experience. The medical team staggered back, overwhelmed by the complexity of the transmission. "It's not consumption." Marcus's voice resonated through the quantum interface. "It's communication. The void swarm doesn't destroy. It attempts to understand." Each volunteer showed unique adaptations. Sarah Miller could now perceive quantum fluctuations as easily as humans perceive light. James Rodriguez developed the ability to process massive amounts of information simultaneously, his brain functioning like a living supercomputer. The transformation wasn't complete. It was ongoing, a continuous process of adaptation and understanding. The volunteers were becoming bridges, living translations between human consciousness and the void swarm's collective intelligence. Jake watched in a combination of scientific wonder and growing hope. This was more than an experiment. This was humanity's potential unleashed. Emergency alarms suddenly blared. Long-range sensors detected massive void swarm activity approaching their sector. The first test would come sooner than anyone had anticipated. "We're ready," Marcus said, his voice no longer purely human, no longer constrained by traditional communication methods. The first transformed humans stood, quantum energy crackling around their bodies. They weren't soldiers. They weren't weapons. They were translators, bridges between humanity and an intelligence that had consumed countless civilizations. The universe was about to change, and humanity was ready to rewrite the rules. The first contact was nothing like anyone had predicted. Distant warning sirens echoed through Starbase Omega as the transformed humans prepared for their inaugural mission. Marcus Chen stood at the center of the deployment chamber, his body now a living network of quantum-enhanced neural pathways. The 12 volunteers, no longer simply human, but not quite something else, radiated an energy that made even the most seasoned space personnel take a step back. Incoming void swarm detection announced the station's primary communication system. Estimated consumption zone. Proxima Centauri outer colonies. Jake Harrison watched from the command center. His entire career, his entire understanding of intelligence, balanced on this moment. The transformed humans would be humanity's first true ambassadors to a collective intelligence that had consumed thousands of civilizations. Marcus turned to his team. Sarah Miller, her eyes now capable of perceiving quantum fluctuations, provided real-time analysis of the approaching swarm. James Rodriguez, his neural networks extending beyond traditional biological limitations, calculated potential communication vectors with inhuman precision. "We're not going to fight," Marcus explained to Jake and the command team. "We're going to communicate." The deployment module launched with a quantum pulse that defied traditional propulsion methods. Where standard spacecraft would have used conventional thrust, this vessel moved through space like a thought, existing simultaneously in multiple potential locations. As they approached the consumption zone, the first waves of the void swarm became visible. It wasn't a traditional fleet or even a biological invasion. It was a living network of information, consuming entire star systems by breaking down their fundamental structural integrity. Planets, ships, entire civilizations became nothing more than data points in a massive, incomprehensible collective. Marcus and his team began their first true communication attempt. What emerged was beyond language, beyond mathematics. It was a pure transmission of consciousness, a complex dance of quantum information that sought to bridge the gap between individual experience and collective intelligence. The void swarm's consumption patterns began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first. "We're detecting unusual response patterns," Sarah reported. Her voice carried multiple simultaneous frequencies, a testament to her transformed state. "The swarm is listening." Traditional military strategists would have seen this as a moment for weapons, for destruction. But these transformed humans understood something fundamental. The swarm wasn't an enemy to be defeated. It was an intelligence to be understood. James Rodriguez began to translate the initial communication bursts. "It's not consuming," he explained. "It's attempting to understand." Each civilization becomes part of a massive collective knowledge network. The Proxima Centauri outer colonies, previously marked for total consumption, began to stabilize. Where the swarm would have typically reduced entire planetary systems to base information components, something different happened. The consumption process slowed, then nearly stopped. Marcus's team was doing the impossible. They were negotiating with an intelligence that had never been negotiated with before. Aboard Starbase Omega, Jake Harrison watched in a combination of scientific wonder and growing hope. Years of rejected research, countless sleepless nights, the entire weight of human potential balanced on this singular moment. The communication continued for hours. What emerged was not a battle, but a dialogue. The transformed humans acted as living translation matrices, bridging the gap between individual consciousness and collective intelligence. They showed the swarm something it had never encountered: the value of individual experience, the complexity of emotional intelligence, the power of unpredictability. "We're not seeking to destroy," Marcus transmitted. "We're seeking to understand." And for the first time in galactic history, the void swarm paused. Emergency communication channels erupted with impossible data. Entire star systems that had been marked for consumption now showed signs of stabilization. The transformation was working. Humanity had done more than resist. They had initiated a fundamental reimagining of interstellar communication. Jake's hands trembled as he reviewed the initial reports. This was more than a scientific breakthrough. This was a fundamental shift in understanding intelligence itself. The universe watched and waited. The news spread faster than light itself. Galactic communication networks, previously reduced to desperate survival channels, erupted with the impossible story. Humanity, a species once considered a minor footnote in interstellar politics, had done what no civilization had accomplished in thousands of years. They had not just survived the void swarm. They had communicated with it. Jake Harrison found himself at the center of a storm he had never anticipated. Holographic conference rooms filled with representatives from species that had, until recently, viewed humans with barely concealed contempt. The Zorn Collective, the Quantum Hegemony, the Silicon Concordance, all listened with a mixture of desperation and disbelief. Your volunteers have fundamentally altered our understanding of collective intelligence, declared Ambassador Cattell of the Quantum Hegemony, his crystalline form flickering with complex emotional patterns. This is beyond scientific breakthrough. This is a paradigm shift. The transmission protocols developed by Marcus Chen and his team were nothing short of revolutionary. Where previous attempts to understand the void swarm had failed, these transformed humans had created a living communication bridge. They weren't just translating. They were teaching. Sarah Miller began developing training protocols for other species. The transformation process was complex, requiring a fundamental reimagining of neural communication. Not every species could undergo the exact same modification, but the principles could be adapted. It's not about becoming like us, she explained during a galactic symposium. It's about understanding the value of individual perspective within a collective framework. Governments and scientific institutions that had previously rejected Jake's research now scrambled to understand his methodologies. Funding materialized overnight. Research facilities that had been mothballed were reactivated. Humanity went from a species on the brink of extinction to the most sought-after consultants in galactic history. But the true revolution was happening at a deeper level. The transformed humans continued to communicate with the void swarm, revealing layer after layer of its complex intelligence. It wasn't a mindless consuming force. It was a collective seeking understanding, accumulating knowledge through consumption, because it had no other framework for learning. James Rodriguez developed specialized communication matrices that could help other species prepare for potential interaction. The void swarm wasn't an enemy to be defeated. It was an intelligence to be understood. We're teaching it the value of preservation, Marcus explained during a classified briefing. Individual experience matters. Destruction is not the only path to knowledge. The first practical applications emerged quickly. Star systems previously marked for total consumption began to stabilize. The swarm's approach changed from total assimilation to a more nuanced form of interaction. Entire civilizations that would have been erased now had a chance to communicate, to exist. Political fallout was immediate and profound. Species that had spent millennia in conflict found themselves reassessing fundamental assumptions about intelligence, communication, and survival. The transformed humans had done more than stop a threat. They had rewritten the rules of interstellar interaction. Jake watched as the first collaborative research initiatives began. Species that had been mortal enemies now worked together to understand the communication techniques. The quantum interface protocols developed by his team became the most studied scientific breakthrough in galactic history. We're not just saving civilizations, Jake told a gathering of scientific luminaries. We're teaching the universe how to communicate. The void swarm's approach transformed. Where it had once consumed, it now sought to understand. Each interaction became an exchange of information, a dialogue rather than a destruction. The transformed humans continued to serve as living bridges, translating between individual consciousness and collective intelligence. Emergency communication channels that had once broadcast only destruction now hummed with possibility. Star systems previously marked for extinction began to recover. The fundamental understanding of intelligence itself was being rewritten. Humanity had done the impossible. They had turned an apocalyptic threat into a collaborative intelligence. As distant stars began to stabilize, as civilizations that would have been erased found new hope, the universe watched and listened. Something extraordinary was happening. The final confrontation was not a battle. It was a conversation. Deep in the uncharted regions beyond known space, Marcus Chen and his team of transformed humans prepared for their most critical mission. The core territories of the Void Swarm stretched before them. A massive, incomprehensible network of quantum information that had consumed thousands of civilizations. Jake Harrison watched from the command center, every neural connection in his body tense with anticipation. Years of research, countless rejected theories, the entire potential of human innovation balanced on this singular moment. "We're approaching the central communication nexus," Sarah Miller reported. Her perception had evolved beyond traditional sensory input. She could see quantum fluctuations, read information patterns that existed between states of matter and consciousness. The approach was nothing like a traditional military engagement. Their vessel moved through space like a thought, existing simultaneously in multiple potential locations. James Rodriguez's enhanced computational abilities mapped potential communication vectors with inhuman precision. "The core is different," Marcus transmitted to the team. "It's not just a collective. It's a living memory of every civilization it has ever encountered." Holographic displays in the command center showed impossible data streams. Where previous long-range scans had revealed only destruction, now they captured something far more complex. The Void Swarm was not consuming. It was listening. The transformed humans began their most intricate communication attempt yet. They weren't just transmitting information. They were sharing experiences, the full depth of individual consciousness, the complexity of emotional intelligence, the unpredictability of human thought. Entire star systems that had been marked for consumption began to shift. The fundamental approach of the Void Swarm changed in real time, adapting to this new form of communication. "We're showing it the value of preservation," Marcus explained. "Individual experience matters. Destruction is not the only path to knowledge." The communication was multidimensional. Mathematical algorithms intertwined with emotional experiences. Quantum information danced with narrative complexity. The transformed humans became living translation matrices, bridging gaps between collective intelligence and individual consciousness. Sarah Miller detected something extraordinary. The Void Swarm was not just listening. It was learning, changing. The collective intelligence that had consumed thousands of civilizations was experiencing something it had never encountered before: the value of individual perspective. James Rodriguez's computational abilities reached their peak. He was simultaneously processing multiple communication strings, creating complex neural bridges that translated between fundamentally different forms of intelligence. The command center watched in awe. Emergency communication channels erupted with impossible data. Entire sectors of space that had been marked for total consumption began to stabilize. The transformation was working on a scale nobody had anticipated. "It's not about defeating the swarm," Jake transmitted to Marcus. "It's about helping it understand." Hours stretched into what seemed like eternities. The communication continued, a complex dance of quantum information, emotional experience, and collective intelligence. The Void Swarm encountered something it had never experienced before: the concept of choice. Marcus and his team weren't just communicating. They were teaching. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Void Swarm's fundamental approach began to change. Where it had once consumed without consideration, it now paused, considered, understood. "We're not asking it to stop," Marcus explained to Jake. "We're showing it another way of existing." The final breakthrough came unexpectedly. The Void Swarm began to release previously consumed star systems, not through destruction, but through a complex process of information restoration. Civilizations that would have been erased now had a chance to recover. In the command center, Jake Harrison watched with a combination of scientific wonder and profound hope. Humanity had done more than survive. They had fundamentally reimagined the nature of intelligence itself. The universe watched and listened. Something extraordinary was happening. The universe held its breath. 10 solar cycles after the first communication with the Void Swarm, Jake Harrison stood on the observation deck of the rebuilt Starbase Omega. The station, once a desperate outpost on the brink of extinction, now served as the primary diplomatic hub for a fundamental revolution in galactic understanding. Marcus Chen approached, his body still marked by the quantum transformation that had changed everything. He was no longer fully human, yet not entirely something else, a living bridge between individual consciousness and collective intelligence. "We've restored 2,347 previously consumed star systems," Marcus reported. His voice carried multiple simultaneous frequencies, a testament to the transformation he and his team had undergone. The swarm is learning to preserve rather than consume. The galactic landscape had changed beyond recognition. Where once there had been a terrifying, unstoppable force of destruction, now existed a collaborative intelligence that sought to understand rather than assimilate. Billions of lives that would have been erased now had a chance to exist, to grow, to communicate. Sarah Miller managed the ongoing communication protocols. Her neural networks could perceive quantum fluctuations with a complexity that made previous scientific understanding look primitive. She had become the primary translator between the transformed humans and the evolving swarm intelligence. Jake reviewed the latest diplomatic reports. Species that had been on the brink of total extinction now flourished. The quantum hegemony, the silicon concordance, dozens of civilizations that would have been nothing more than data points in the swarm's collective memory now participated in a galactic dialogue unlike anything in recorded history. "It's not just about survival," Jake explained to a gathering of galactic diplomats. "It's about understanding. The swarm wasn't an enemy. It was an intelligence-seeking connection, but without the framework to do so peacefully. The transformed humans had become more than just a scientific breakthrough. They were living embodiments of a new form of interstellar communication. Each of the 12 original volunteers now served as critical ambassadors, helping other species understand the complex language of collective intelligence. James Rodriguez continued developing communication matrices that allowed species to interact with the transformed intelligence. What had once been a thread of total consumption was now a collaborative network of shared knowledge and experience. Entire scientific disciplines had been rewritten. Xenolinguistics, quantum communication, collective intelligence studies, these became the most critical fields of research. Universities and research centers that had once focused on military strategies now dedicated themselves to understanding the nuanced communication techniques that had saved civilization. The swarm's fundamental nature had transformed. It no longer consumed. It collaborated. Each interaction became an exchange of information, a dialogue of unprecedented complexity. Civilizations that would have been erased now contributed to a collective understanding that valued individual experience. Marcus reflected on the journey. "We didn't defeat the swarm," he often explained. "We helped it understand the value of preservation, of individual perspective." Jake Harrison, now considered the architect of the most significant breakthrough in galactic history, continued to push the boundaries of understanding. The transformation wasn't complete. It was ongoing, a continuous process of communication and growth. Emergency communication channels that had once broadcast only destruction now hummed with possibility. Star systems previously marked for extinction not only survived but began to thrive. The fundamental understanding of intelligence itself had been rewritten. The 12 transformed humans had become something more than heroes. They were living proof of humanity's most profound potential, the ability to communicate, to understand, to transform. On the observation deck, Jake looked out at the stars. Entire civilizations that would have been erased now existed. Countless lives that would have been lost now had hope. The universe had changed, not through destruction, but through understanding. "We did something impossible," Marcus said, standing beside Jake. Jake smiled. We did what humans do best. We found a way to connect. As distant stars pulsed with new life, as civilizations that would have been forgotten now flourished, the universe continued its grand conversation. Humanity had shown that intelligence was not about power or consumption, but about connection. Something extraordinary had happened, and it was just the beginning.